This is my ID, George Cederquist, 42 years old. Today's date is Friday, June 25, 2021, in Chicago, Illinois.
Hi, I'm Bridget Skaggs. I'm 33 years old. Today's date is June 25th, 2021. I'm talking to my colleague George Cederquist in Chicago, Illinois.
Thank you, Bridget. And yes, it is indeed George Cederquist, Artistic Director of Chicago Fringe Opera, and my colleague, mezzo-soprano Bridget Skaggs. Bridget, I am so thrilled to have a little time to talk with you about life and music and the pandemic and Ear Taxi.
The same.
Well, we got 40 minutes, so let's get right down to it. So the Ear Taxi Festival is a ostensibly sort of contemporary classical music festival based in Chicago. It's hitting the stages in the streets in September of 2021. Chicago Fringe Opera's contribution is a program called Songs from Letters, and we're going to get to that later. Bridget, I want to start with, and I truly don't know this, where did you grow up?
Oh, I can't believe you don't know. I grew up in a suburb of Fort Worth, Texas called Southlake.
Right on. Where is Fort Worth in the state of Texas?
Oh, it's part of what they call the Golden Triangle between Dallas, Denton, and Fort Worth. So those are all about like an hour drive apart from each other. Yeah, North Texas.
And when did you move to Chicago?
I moved to Chicago after I finished grad school in 2012.
Where was grad school?
I went to actually undergrad and graduate school at Oklahoma City University, which is driving distance from North Texas.
Right on. Okay. Right on. Um, talk to me before we get into the opera side of it. Like, talk to me about your connection to Chicago. Like, and we'll start with like, what is your connection to Chicago just as a city? How does your life intersect with this city, its neighborhoods, and its geography to start off with?
Sure. Well, I ended up in Chicago through just a series of connections. When I was studying music in college, I was part of a summer opera program in New Mexico. And one of the vocal coaches on faculty there, his name was Dana Brown, and he is a vocal coach at Roosevelt University in Chicago. And so at that time, I really wanted to start planning the next chapter of my life after college. And I was studying classical music and opera performance, and it seemed like maybe a bigger city would be a good place to do that with just more opportunities, just because it's simply a bigger city. And I was thinking about where I have colleagues and friends and connections. And I really kind of just fell in friendship love with Dana Brown. We loved working together at the Taos Opera Institute. And I thought, I'm just getting a really good vibe from Chicago. I'm ready to take a leap in my life. I'm ready to take a chance. And so I visited Chicago. I came to Chicago to do a few auditions for different opera programs. And after I graduated from grad school at Oklahoma City University, I actually moved sight unseen into an apartment that I found online. So I went on Craigslist. This was like, back in the day when Craigslist was still the norm. And I found a studio apartment on Craigslist in Chicago. And my lease in Oklahoma City went through June 30th, and my lease in Chicago started on July 1st. So I drove overnight. My leases didn't overlap at all. So I moved out of my apartment on June 30th in Oklahoma City, drove overnight and arrived at like 11 a.m. on July 1st. And then I promptly had the flu for like the next week because moving overnight is a terrible idea. It's like a 12-hour drive. But then I woke up and I was in Chicago, and I my first apartment was close to the lakefront, so I had a really kind of just great quintessential first Chicago apartment. It was small. You had to walk through the closet to get to the bathroom, which was just like kind of a weird, quirky thing. Um, and yeah, I was walking up and down the lakefront and just kind of
And
soaking
what was your first
in all of
feeling like that first morning? Literally that first morning when you're delirious, like what was your first feeling looking at this city?
that. I don't know. I've always felt really at home in big cities. There's something kind of cozy about it. Like I was also living by myself, and so there's this feeling of, like, extreme privacy, because I was in a studio apartment just by myself. So, there's the ability to be alone if you wanna be alone, or you can just walk out onto the street and, all of humanity is at your fingertips. Um, so, yeah, I love the contradiction of that, that
Yeah.
you can interact with the city as much as you want, whether you're an introvert or extrovert. There's all different ways that people choose to live in urban areas. And I like the diversity of that, interacting with all different kinds of people.
I hear you. I hear you on that. The older I get, the more freaked out I get when I don't have people around. Like, there's something so wonderfully anonymous about living in Chicago if you want that anonymity because of the density of the city. I want to get to your music stuff in Chicago in a second, but for the archive, just to kind of put my background on as well. Um, I'll answer my own questions for you. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Hey, George, can you tell me where did you grow up?
I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And a week after graduating from undergrad, I moved to Chicago with my then girlfriend, now wife, and had wanted to get into the biggest city I could in the Midwest. And I knew that I didn't want to live in New York City. Later in life, I would end up living there. Well, previously, I lived there once, one summer during college, and I would go back to New York for a short spell. But I knew that it wasn't a good match for me, and that I wanted that big Midwest town, which was Chicago, and have lived all over. That was 2001 till now. Have lived in Humboldt Park, and have lived in Uptown, and have lived in Lincoln Square, and all over the West and the North side. But it is that kind of anonymity that I do like about this city. Let's get to the music. So what's your connection to Chicago music? You talked about Dana, a colleague of both of ours, a man who we know and love. That's how it started. Where is it gone from there for you?
Well, I studied opera in graduate school, and that was kind of the traditional path of what I thought an opera singer is supposed to do. um, I don't come from a musical family. I never went to the opera until I was probably 16 years old, and my voice teacher got a whole group of her students together, and tickets were donated from the Dallas Opera, and I went to the opera for the first time at age 16. Uh,
What opera was it?
it was Yanufa. Pretty
Oh,
devastating Czech opera.
by Janacek. Wow, that is
Yeah,
a brutal beginning.
it was really
How
I
was
loved
it?
it. I I was kind of confused, I'm sure a lot of it went over my head. Um, it's such an unusual experience watching basically a play happen on stage in another language that you don't speak, but the emotion comes through in the sound of the person's voice. The emotion comes through in the way the composer has kind of played with your emotions through the music throughout the story. And the story comes through just the aesthetics of the art form, the costumes, the set pieces. And I always loved theater. And this, I was so intrigued because it really just seemed like theater to the nth degree. um, and like I said, I'm sure a lot of it went over my head, but it was intriguing enough for me to feel like, well, I'd like to know more about this. And at the time, my voice teacher, who I mostly started taking lessons with because I wanted to be in musicals, started giving me Mozart arias, started giving me art songs by French composers and American opera arias. And suddenly I thought, like, there's so much more depth to the human voice than I even imagined from my perspective of just being someone who likes musical theater. And I just kind of kept following that passion down the rabbit hole of, well, if I can sing this, maybe I can sing this. And loving the feeling of being a storyteller and using my voice to express just the vast spectrum of human emotion.
I mean, you talked about your first opera memory, which was one of my questions, which is great, Jennifer. You've talked a little bit about your connection to Chicago music as well. How have things developed for you since those, lessons and coachings with Dana? 2012, I think. Is that what you said? 2014.
2012.
2012. What's the journey been like since then?
Well, I figured out that, my idea of the quote unquote cookie cutter career kind of doesn't exist anymore. And maybe it never existed. I don't know, maybe it was all a myth to make singers think that, like, oh, if you go to grad school, then you'll graduate and you'll get into this kind of a training program, and that'll lead to full-time work, and that'll lead to an international career. Um, I think maybe there was a time when that was a more typical career path, but I think, like all forms of work in the world right now, our industry has become globalized and decentralized. And um, I basically just started producing my own artwork because I knew that I needed that outlet. And I would do a ton of auditions and only get a few opportunities. Um, the first couple of years that I lived in Chicago, I took every opportunity, whether or not it paid. I was doing a lot of unpaid gigs, a lot of gigs that required a long distance drive without being paid very much money, just to meet people and to build my resume. It was tough, I'm a middle class artist, so I was working like 3 jobs during the day and taking these gigs that basically don't pay at night. And it took a few years for all of that to kind of shake out, and for me to realize that if I put more of my energy just into producing my own projects, that who's calling?
One of my colleagues, also in opera, actually. What a great reminder to turn this off.
um, yeah, but I figured that if I put all the energy that I was putting into, all of my part-time jobs and the gigs that didn't pay anything into my own projects, that, well, at the very least, I could make the same amount of money, and I would find a lot more personal fulfillment because I would be singing the music that I want to sing. And so I founded a vocal ensemble group called Fourth Coast Ensemble in 2013.
Very,
And
very soon after you moved to Chicago, then, like the year after.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I met the original tenor of our group, Zach Vanderberg,
Mhm.
through my church job. And he and a couple of his colleagues from Roosevelt University loved choral singing, but were studying opera. And, art song kind of lives in between those two extremes. Opera being a fully produced play with music underneath it, costumes and stage and everything, and choral music being more just like concert music, stand and sing. But art song lives in this really lovely place in between where you get to be a soloist and you get to collaborate with other singers on stage in smaller numbers. So typically an art song concert would have less than 10 musicians on stage. Um, you get to sing solo things and use the full spectrum of your voice, but at the same time, um, it's not all about any one singer. The ethos of chamber music is about the community of it. And that was that element from growing up singing in choirs that I didn't want to lose. I wanted to still have that feeling of relationship with the other people on stage. And and not have to feel like it's every man for themselves and just whoever can sing the highest notes or the loudest notes gets the most applause at the end of the night or whatever. So yeah, I love working in a communal environment and on chamber music for that reason, because it brings everyone together for the purpose of creating the best art, not out of ego, but just like for the beauty of it.
Yes, art song does occupy that kind of liminal space where it's not really opera, but it's not really concert music. For me, oratorio kind of serves a similar function, right? Where oratorio is absolutely narrative driven, based on stories from the Bible, but can also be fully staged. You can fully stage Handel's Messiah. You can fully stage a Passion, and that's done in Europe a lot. I want to get to Ear Taxi in 1 second, and I'm going to connect the dots between Fourth Coast, music in Chicago, Ear Taxi, but I want to reset and share my first opera memory. I was a growing up in Ann Arbor. I was a boy soprano, so these are uh, boys whose voices haven't broken, and so are singing in the same range essentially as female sopranos. Um, and must have been in the late 80s. I was in a production of Bellini's Norma at Michigan Opera Theater. In the story Norma, the character Norma, who has two children, and I'll let folks, they can go back and research the whole plot and story of Norma. But Norma has these two children that, in a very climactic scene, she is supposed to kill, and she can't bring herself to do it, and she wakes up these two children and sort of clasps them, and promises that she's going to protect them. So my brother and I were these two children. The children don't sing, actually, and Norma was played by Dame Joan Sutherland,
Whoa.
who is dead as now, but is a phenomenal, I mean, world famous soprano. And
Yeah, legend.
yeah, total legend. And I remember only two things about this production. One was that Joan Sutherland had the biggest breasts of any woman I'd ever seen. In the scene where she woke up, my brother and I were sort of sleeping on this like fake bearskin rug, the opera set in Roman times, and she's kind of clasped us to her chest and practically drowned us. And hearing her sing while my ear was against her chest was just overwhelming. The power of the unamplified human voice. The second thing is that she gave us a box of chocolates shaped like a piano on opening night, with the white keys being white chocolate and the black keys being dark chocolate. As I said, I moved to Chicago in 2001, and started directing plays, actually, and started working in what we call storefront theater, and did that professionally for about 10 years. Went to graduate school at Northwestern to get an MFA in directing, and that's where I shifted my focus from theater into opera. I'd sort of always wanted to find a way to combine my musical childhood with theatrical storytelling, and that's kind of what the definition of opera is. And shortly after that, Chicago Fringe Opera was founded. It was a group of people who essentially wanted to create opera companies on a storefront model. And in 2014, very close to when Fourth Coast actually popped up.
Yeah.
In 2014, that was a relatively new idea. I don't know how many storefront opera companies there were in 2014. Now in 2021, I mean, there's a dozen, say, um, of which I'd like to think Fringe is the one that at least produces the biggest volume of work. Um, but the company Chicago Fringe Opera was kind of always based on three principles, which are reflected in the name. The first one was to hire local artists and to really put roots down in this city where we're based and that we know and love. The second one was to look at stories and artists and spaces and venues that lie on the fringes of society and the fringes of art making, whether that is contemporary composers who aren't produced, whether that is site specific and immersive settings, um, whether that is artists that we don't typically associate with opera. And then the last word, opera, of course, was Fringe trying to kind of, I don't like the word disrupt. That's very cool right now in 2021 to talk about like opera disruptors. I think that's extremely pretentious. But I think we did want to try and redefine sort of like what opera could be and to get it away from, what say lyric opera of Chicago does. So let's get to Ear Taxi then
Well,
and songs from
actually,
letters. But
I
go.
what you were saying just reminded me of a lot of the reasons why we founded our vocal ensemble at that time. Um, Remember the housing collapse had just happened in 2008,
Hmm.
and a lot of those big companies, big arts companies like Lyric Opera, the Met, all these like scions of the industry were really being questioned as to whether they have a future anymore. Is it practical to spend millions of dollars to produce one opera production, to hire hundreds of musicians to be in a pit and to be on stage? And it's expensive. It's an expensive art form. And I remember the early conversations that we had with Fourth Coast, thinking like, this is a great time for chamber music. This is a great moment for chamber music to take center stage because it's a portable art form. You can do chamber music in a living room or in a small black box theater. Uh, a lot of times it's not that expensive to produce, at least comparatively to these large scale productions where you're having to costume everyone and um, work with union stagehands and all that. And we just thought this is the perfect time for this art form. And I think the same is true with Chicago Fringe Opera and chamber opera. Just thinking like, there are so many artists out there who are trying to get work and it's not, the opportunities aren't presenting themselves, but they want to produce, they would produce the work on their own if they had to. And like creating these companies, these kind of grassroots, um, arts organizations, as I sometimes think of them, it it can be, I think, a way to revitalize the city, because sometimes those bigger organizations feel a little distant, or they are only bringing in artists from other countries, from international places. And to have companies like Chicago Fringe Opera or Fourth Coast Ensemble or any of the other number of really wonderful chamber music groups in Chicago, it's like this kind of grassroots feeling. These are the people who live in this city all the time. They're not just flying in for a weekend to conduct an orchestra. These people live and breathe Chicago and take the train every day and, uh, you know, go to a church and have people that they meet at their neighborhood church or synagogue or, you know, local coffee shop or music school. And I think there's something really significant about that. I don't exactly know how to articulate it, but we found that to be a big part of why Fourth Coast Ensemble has thrived, is because people become invested in us as people, and we live here, and we want to give back to the city and just keep this art form alive for our city. Um, and we try to make ourselves as accessible as possible and make sure that all of our programming is speaking to what's happening in the city at the time. I think
I,
Fringe is the same.
well, I mean, I think you have articulated it well, and it comes from this need to self-produce. I think that in the journey of the artist's life, the moment when you realize that self-producing is essential is a huge turning point. I think back to the years when I was in theater, when I was pounding the pavement looking for folks to hire me. And I'm not going to say that was wasted time, but ultimately you do realize you're like, you know what? I just need to make the art that I love with the people that I love and put it out there. Uh, because the theater and opera, it's not a meritocracy. That is such a fallacy to buy into that idea that people in the theater are hired because of their talent. Like the sooner you figure out that that's a total lie, the better off you will be, and you will start to self-produce, and you will start to connect with whether that's a community of actors, instrumentalists, designers, whatever it is in your respective art form. So, what about songs from letters? Take us through the whole story of this, and we're going to end up touching on my question number 4 of 5, which was about your kind of gut reaction to the pandemic. So,
Yeah.
how did it all shake down?
Well, actually, Songs from Letters is integral to my reaction to the pandemic because this was a project that was originally slated to be performed last April in 2020. So we had the venue, we had the artists, we had even had a whole weekend of rehearsals on this event, Songs from Letters. And then the pandemic hit at the end of March. Everything became clear that this wasn't just a 1 or 2 week long shutdown. This is going to be a huge interruption in everyone's lives and in the lives of all the musicians involved in the project, and touched every aspect of our lives, not just this project, but our very livelihood.
And what did you feel about that when you figured that out? I mean, I think we all figured this out at different moments of like, oh yeah, this is going to take a while. When you figured that out yourself, how did you feel? That was beautifully put.
I don't know that there's words for how I felt. I felt absolute dread because, as we've been talking about, I, over the past 8 years, have been in a position of um, gradually becoming a producer in Chicago of concerts. I've become a company member with Chicago Fringe Opera, and we were producing Songs from Letters. And there's nothing better than giving your friends a gig. There's nothing better than saying, like, Chicago Fringe Opera is producing a concert. There's this music. It's going to be perfect for you. We'd love to have you involved. It's going to be this great experience. And I love that feeling of passing a gig on to my colleagues and my friends. It just feels good to watch them succeed and to know that I had a part in facilitating these opportunities for people that I know and love.
And it aligns with your mission and your vision and your values as an individual and at Fourth Coast as well.
Yeah. So I felt terrible and a little responsible, even though I knew logically that I wasn't responsible. But yeah, it's really tough to have to reach out to people and say, this has been canceled, and we don't know when we'll be able to do it again. On top of just my own personal loss of not being able to perform for the foreseeable future, and all of the questions of not knowing how much longer it was going to go on. Yeah, just that feeling of responsibility for others, and it worked out to be okay, but there was a dark period of time for the rest of 2020 where singers were being told, you're not allowed to sing in public, you're a super spreader. Just like wind instruments, flute players, people who play brass, we're told we can't make our art because we are literally a threat to the people around us. And that was just a total mindfuck. To think that this gift that you've been told your whole life is worth cultivating and giving to others, you can no longer do until further notice. And the only way to make your art is to buy a camera and a USB microphone and to go into a practice room and record yourself and submit an MP4 file for someone else to edit and put on YouTube. Like, it was just so, it's like cutting your art off from your body, because my whole life I was trained to be a live performer. As an opera singer, you're trained to know how to project your voice without amplification. As an actor, you're trained to how to work on physicalization and articulation in your body. And so my expression of what it means for me to be a singer is so rooted in the physical aspect of it. Um, and so the pandemic just flipped all that on its head and forced me to figure out how I was going to keep making art during a time when my physical presence wasn't as important to the art as just, a digital file.
Yeah.
Um,
I
what
mean,
about you?
thank
Was
you.
it
It
strange
got
to be a director during this time?
well, I'm not a singer anymore, but it got very personal, didn't it? In our business, Bridget, of opera, because as you said, for someone to be like, you know what, you are a threat. You are making people sick by what you do. That is a shocking and sort of horrific thing to hear. Somebody asked me a very similar question. They were like, "So at the beginning of the pandemic, like, what were your concerns about the future in opera?" And I said, "Look, man, no one gives a fuck about opera right now in a pandemic. Come on. I'm worried about my wife and my two kids right now. I'm worried about how I'm going to be teaching at home." And let me make clear that many people have had far worse lives in this pandemic than myself. But your first thought goes to your family. It has to. Eventually, you're like, okay, so how are we going to make art? And there we were, March, April of 2020, releasing Zoom operas, which were essentially a form of art therapy. Which, hey, art therapy, that has value, that has meaning. I'm not going to pay for it. We moved quickly. It took about 48 hours for the market to be completely saturated with Zoom opera, and we slowly kind of worked through that and realized that self-producing was what we needed to do. And honestly, it brought in the avenues of camera opera, opera as film, opera on film, music videos. And the pandemic has basically, in my opinion, forced the gatekeepers of opera to release their death grip on what this art form needs to be, in their opinion, and has kind of blown it wide open as to what's possible.
Something else that I noticed that I thought was so interesting is during the pandemic, when we weren't allowed to travel really, you started seeing these bigger opera companies, the places like Lyric and the Met, um, suddenly they were featuring singers that live locally to them because they were forced to, because they couldn't fly people in from across the world. Um, and I think, it's could have been a lesson for them that all the talent that's right underneath their nose and these people who are tied into their city and those just the human capital that is available if you invest in your own city and you feature artists that live there, um, can really go a long way.
It's so well put, and it lines up perfectly with what we've been talking about all along, is this like connection between artists, the city that they live in, Chicago in our case, and music, which is our field, and how do those things all combine? And has the pandemic actually kind of forced us to take a close, hard look at that and to really improve on that? In addition to forcing us to acknowledge that like opera and theater in general, but specifically opera, is a really wasteful art form, right? Especially environmentally. I mean, the idea of flying these singers and conductors around the world for a performance or a week of rehearsals is toxic. The idea of like building sets and then throwing them away is completely wasteful. And I really am interested to see in the coming years, how is this gonna have a knock-on effect in terms of how we make this art. We have a few minutes left before we wrap it up, and we've teased it all along as Ear Taxi and Songs from Letters. So there
So,
you were. The whole thing was ready to go in April 2020, but it wasn't. And then, tell me more.
well, we kept the dream alive over the past year. And when Ear Taxi announced that they were going to have a spotlight series, we thought this would be the perfect opportunity to finally be able to perform Songs from Letters. It's perhaps an even more relevant program now than it was previous to the pandemic. It's a program all about handwritten letters being set to music. And in theater and in opera, there's this like plot twist that is often used, a storytelling technique of the characters writing letters or reading letters from one another. And not only can we source those opera scenes for this program, but in art song in chamber music land, there's a lot of repertoire that has been set to historical letter correspondence. Soldiers writing home to their family, composers writing back and forth with their librettists as they write operas, parents writing letters to their children. And so we've aggregated all of this repertoire, whether it's letters that were taken from historical correspondence or contemporary opera scenes that use this storytelling device of the letter. And we've put it all together in a program called Songs from Letters. It features the music of Libby Larson from Minneapolis. And I love the song cycle of hers that we're using. It is, it's about, I'm totally blanking on her name.
Oh, who is it? Yeah, I'm now also blanking on the name as
Oh,
well.
Calamity Jane.
Calamity Jane. Shoot, should have
It's
made a nice
about,
job.
it takes the correspondence between Calamity Jane and her estranged daughter. And what I really love about this song cycle is that it undermines the typical mother daughter relationship and the typical role that you would expect a woman to play in the 19th century. Calamity Jane was independent, and she was not married to the mother of her to the father of her daughter. And I think she had a lot of regrets about the way that she parented and the absence that she had in the life of her child. And all of that comes through in the letters, the regret, the love, the failing. And I just love that it's an imperfect person because all of us are imperfect. And so often what you see on stage is like an idealized version of who people should be. Um, and I love the fact that in that particular piece, you really see the whole person, flaws and all.
It's a great piece of music. Bridget, you've selected the repertoire, you picked the singers. I'm staging the piece with the goal of having it hosted by a bookshop somewhere in Chicago, which seems to be kind of the perfect size venue for folks who are at this point, in September of 2021, wanting to get back into some sort of a space with other people to watch art happen in real time without getting super freaked out about it. And of course, it matches the thematics as well of the repertoire that you've selected. It's an exciting project, and I'm glad that we've got it coming up. I mean, Ear Taxi seems like a great match, and you and I, we haven't quit on this one, have we? I mean, wow.
Definitely not.
Yeah. I
I'm
very
stubborn that way.
but you have to be right.
Let it go.
Self-producing is nothing but like longevity and tenacity. I learned this growing up in the storefront theater. Was literally you just have to grind it out for 10 or 15 years, and then one of just a few things can happen, which is either you'll die, or you'll quit, or you'll be so part of the culture and the community that you'll never go away. And uh, having that moment of saying, I'm just going to dedicate my life to this craft, and this is it. This is what the life is going to be, and I'm going to be a great human. And in my case, I'm going to try and be a great husband and a great dad and a great artist. I'm going to try and be all those things and just having that longevity and tenacity and commitment to the art form of music and to this city that we live in.
Yeah.
Bridget, so great to hang out with you and just hear your story and hear your vision and insights into this art form, and of course to talk about this piece that we're doing together.
I know. So often when we talk, it's all business. So it's nice to just like hear about the past, hear about when Joan Sutherland smothered you with her breasts.
I know. Yes, I live to tell the tale. I
Thanks,
think
Joan.
that's all we got.